And in the time since this book was published, two people who are mentioned in it have died, and I wanted to mention them. One is my Aunt Eleanor, who appears in the essay, The Blue Heron Returns. She's the wonderful woman who, at a certain time in her grieving, saw her husband return to her in the form of a bird. And the other is Bernie Rollin, an animal ethicist who was also a professor of philosophy at Colorado State and was really helpful to me in the essay Schrodinger's Dogs in talking about the beagle colonies in Fort Collins and animal experimentation. So I'd like to dedicate my reading tonight to Eleanor Townsend and Bernie Rollin. I wanted to read some splotches from my introduction to give you a sense of what I mean by animal disorders, and then a couple excerpts from an essay, and it should come in under 20 minutes. So this is from the introduction. A man cages lions and tigers in his backyard. A woman's house teems with so many cats she's lost count and doesn't even notice when one dies. A man longing to become one with bears gets devoured by one. Animal disorders, I call them, these enactments by a select few individuals of much more widespread cultural disorders. Their extreme versions of unhealthy relationships with animals capture irreconcilable contradictions and impossibilities in our approaches to non-human animals, contradictions that we might otherwise manage to repress. More mundane contradictions abound, often unnoticed. Millions of people who condemn cockfighting will eat the carcasses of chickens that were crammed into cages and debeaked to keep them from pecking each other to death during their short lives. Our culture euthanizes hundreds of thousands of unwanted dogs every year while spending millions of dollars on a wanted few. Researchers sacrifice one dog to save another. An animal rights advocate may condemn animal cruelty in research laboratories, but receive radiation therapy treatments first tested out on beagles. A woman who considers herself a vegetarian feeds her dogs meat. These are some of the everyday symptoms of animal disorders that I find myself in. What follows are personal essays exploring disordered relationships with animals on the part of myself and my human culture. I would characterize myself as having a fairly representative case of early stage animal disorder. I'm the woman referred to above, the one who considers herself a vegetarian, but feeds her dogs meat. I'm not a hoarder quite yet, and I don't live among bears or run with wolves, but just a small change in a variable or two of my life might produce a very different story. You may hear in my term animal disorders the echo of other disorders like sleep disorders or eating disorders. Feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux has proposed that eating disorders are crystallizations of culture. Their symptoms make manifest not just individual psyches, but also cultural ailments. Eating disorders emerged historically at a time when Western culture's approaches to food consumption and women's bodies clashed. The individuals who developed eating disorders were primarily women responding to impossibly contradictory cultural demands. Eat, but don't eat. Consume everything, but restrain yourself. You deserve to indulge yourself, but your worth comes from denying yourself. Their disordered eating forms a compromise among irreconcilable desires and demands. And so too with sleep disorders, we're a culture that is very contradictory and has very disordered relationships with time and speed and the rhythms of our bodies. And they manifest in some people in sleep disorders. So too with animal disorders. When it comes to both domesticated and wild animals, we make oxymorons of ourselves. We are a culture whose approach to our non-human kin is contradictory. As psychologist Hal Herzog puts it so eloquently in his book of the same title, some we love, some we hate, some we eat. And I would add, some we love to death. In this era of mass extinctions, we long to connect with the dying wild, even though acting on that longing may hasten the extinction. We become lovers of a nature that's harmed by our consumption of it. Our culture produces a Terry Thompson, raising endangered tigers in Ohio backyard, and then setting them free into an urban safari, as I explore in the essay, The Other Thompson, which I'll read from in a minute. Or we create a Timothy Treadwell, destroyed by and destroying the grizzly bear he longs to become. Maybe we express our love for wild animals by hunting them, or seek oneness with nature by capturing its inhabitants. We're a bundle of contradictions when it comes to animals. We'll do anything to save some animals while casually obliterating others. We treat some animals more humanely than we treat some humans, while killing others just for sport. We can't seem to figure out even the legal, much less the ethical status of animals. We can't figure out whether domestic animals are objects we own or wards we steward. We don't know how to value nature or even what nature is. I sometimes wonder if 21st century US culture is so enmeshed in its animal disorders that it doesn't even know how to dream of recovery. So that's from the introduction. And then I want to read from the essay, The Other Thompson, which was spurred by an incident in 2011 where a man named Terry Thompson, no relation to me, but kind of it turns out he does have a relation to me, collected exotic animals, including lions and tigers, other large carnivores. And one October day, he set them free and committed suicide. And I kind of became obsessed with that incident and with exotic animal hoarding and other animal hoarding. And the more I read, the more fascinated I got. So this essay is a result of my thinking about that. As I researched Terry Thompson and animal hoarding, I learned that exotics ownership in the US is far more common than you might think. There are more tigers in captivity just in the US today than exist in the wild worldwide. Across this country, backyards and garages and basements hold exotics of all kinds. Lions and tigers, of course, but also giraffes, zebras, chimpanzees, hyenas, gazelles, lynx, kangaroos, and a surprising number of orangutans, lemurs, alligators, cobras, pythons, pangolins, and Komodo dragons, and that's just for starters. The breeding and trade of exotics is big business. And while it's largely gone underground now due to increasing regulations, it's still thriving. The animals, of course, rarely thrive. Nor is the impulse to own wildness particular to contemporary Americans. References to the captivation of animals stretch back through history. Exotic animal hoarding has long been understood as a sign of evil, or, relatedly, as a display of power. Consider Nero's beloved tigress Phoebe, his alter id, said to feed on his human enemies. Contemporary cases also abound, such as Uday Hussein's private zoo of exotic carnivores, rumored to have fed on the human flesh of Hussein's enemies, but left to starve when Hussein evacuated Baghdad. More recently, drug dealers are reputed to have moved beyond pit bulls as status symbols to lions, tigers, and panthers. In fact, there seems to be an uncanny overlap between exotic animal collecting and imperialism, cultural critics have noted. Colonizers regularly brought back live trophies from the lands they dominated, in part as proof of mastery, but also as objects of curiosity. It's no mere coincidence that the era of global imperialism overlaps with the heyday of empiricism, with its appetite for knowing the unknown. Both share a limitless acquisitiveness. The notoriously bizarre Victorian menageries, including such curiosities as peacocks, orangutans, and baboons, provided mascots for an era of European consumption of other continents, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Critics of modern zoos and circuses, similarly, see these places as embodiments of human will to power knowledge. We've told ourselves our desire to understand other species justifies forcing animals into captivity. Our contemporary culture translates desire into consumerism, telling us that if we love something, we should own it. We express our desire for the wild by consuming it. Still, I sense something else too, lying beyond this well-criticized acquisitiveness, cruelty, and will to power knowledge. Something even more destructive, but more difficult simply to condemn. And then finally, here's me thinking through what that thing might be. And that's some of what this essay was about, is why would anyone collect exotic animals? To experience as human what it's like to be non-human, that may be the ultimate metaphysical paradox. I wonder if that's why so many religions solve this paradox through mythical creatures, impossibly part human and part animal. Fauns, sphinxes, satyrs, centaurs, mermaids, elephant gods, and fallen angels become serpents. Or sometimes as creatures who metamorphose from human to animal. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, Actaeon, hunter of deer, himself turns into an ungulate, horns sprouting from his head as he hears his baying dogs approach. It's what many hunters say hunting gives them, the necessity to think like both predator and prey. They experience the wildness and animal exigencies of these non-human species. Contemporary American pop culture offers its own pantheon of human-animal hybrids: Spider-Man, Batman, Catwoman, and an infestation of werewolves and blood-sucking vampires. These freakish monsters demonstrate, at least to me, something of the desire for becoming animal, to borrow French philosopher Gilles Deleuze's phrase. The word demonstrate derives from the same root as monster, and monsters can show us our subterranean selves, but they can also show us something not self. These monsters may demonstrate our impossible desire to know the world as only a non-human animal can know it. In real life, such hybridity is impossible. The human dies in its transformation to animal. Actaeon, turning into a stag, is in the same instant attacked by his own hunting dogs and mauled out of existence. Timothy Treadwell only became bear in death at the end of his 13th summer of peaceful coexistence with bears. One of them attacked Treadwell and his girlfriend. Their remains were later found in the digestive tract of a suspected grizzly, killed as part of the investigation. Treadwell's fantasy of being inside of a bear, of metamorphosing into one, was eerily realized. However, his love of bears killed not only 2 human beings, but at least 1 ursine being as well. That's what happens when a person tries to become animal. Ultimately, animal wildness is always beyond reach. The desire to connect with something wild is a doomed and dooming desire. The very act of connection contaminates the otherness and the wildness, and often the animal itself. It's an unstable, untenable contradiction, this tragic, dysfunctional love, unrequited and unrequitable. I imagine these deeply paradoxical urges consuming Terry Thompson. So this is how I understand Terry Thompson, driven not only by a will to power, but also by fascination, by a perverted reverence, a longing to cross species and become part of a non-human family, to be raised by other animals, to submit to their animality in all its alienness, as well as startling familiarity. More mind-altering than hallucinogens, this animality opens onto other worlds of knowing, other ways of sensing and experiencing. What does it mean to think through smell, as my dogs do, or to hear ultrasonic stirrings, or to sense the Earth's magnetic pull? People driven by this curiosity, this hunger, find the otherness of animals not just fascinating, but sacred. What, after all, is a religious experience, if not a radical humbling before a force much greater than ourselves, a force that is ultimately unknowable. In the end, Thompson, like Treadwell, was perversely metamorphosed into his animals at death, becoming one with them. Apparently, he spread the remains of a dead chicken on himself to attract his animals to his body, which may be why police discovered Thompson's corpse as it was being devoured by one of his tigers. Maybe this is what he wanted, this literal incorporation. It may be the only way a person can truly become animal. Thank you.